Zen plays a little game with you. Whenever anybody like myself or Dr. Suzuki talks about Zen, all the other people say, because they talk about it, they don't understand it. Those, in the words of Lao Tzu, who know do not say. Those who say do not know. And yet he said that. He wrote a book of several 80 chapters or so to explain the Tao and the De, its power, and nobody can help themselves. They've got to talk. Human beings are a bunch of chatterboxes. And when we've got something in our minds that we want to talk about, we talk. Now, poetry, though, is the great language, because poetry is the art of saying what can't be said. Every poet knows this. You're trying to describe the indescribable, and every poet also knows that nothing is describable. Whether you take some sort of ineffable mystical experience at one extreme, or whether you take an ordinary rusty nail at the other, nothing is really describable. In the words of the famous Count Korzybski, whatever you say something is, it isn't. So in this way, you see, nothing can really be described. And yet, on the other hand, we all know perfectly well what we mean when we talk. If you shared an experience with somebody else, then of course you can talk about it. We can all talk about fire and air and water and wood because we know what it is. And there's no mystery. So in the same way, when it comes to discussing something so esoteric as Zen, it can be discussed. Only, Zen people play games with each other. I remember when I met Paul Reps for the first time, who wrote that lovely book, Zen Flesh and Zen Bones. And he said to me, well, he said, you've written quite a number of books by now. You must think you're pretty fancy. I said, I haven't said a word. No, this is simply a Zen game. And people sort of feel each other out. There's a poem which says, when two Zen masters meet each other on the road, they need no introduction. Thieves recognize one another instantaneously. So now, having got that off my chest, it's to say then, if I were to give you a really proper and a really and truly educative talk about Zen, I would gather you around here and sit here in silence for 5 minutes and leave. And in a way, this would be a much more direct exposition of it than what I'm going to do instead, which is talk about it. Only I have a feeling that you would feel that you were disappointed and somewhat cheated by this kind of behavior if I just left in 5 minutes silence.
So here I am, as Alan Watts says it best, trying to describe something ineffable, and this is the topic in a video that I've been wanting to make for a while. I decided, instead of trying to make it perfect, I'm just going to sit down and try to get going on it. And in a way, I can't help but start with my own story, my own path, because that's what this is all about, I guess, in the end. So a little over 10 years ago, I was an adventurer and a bit of an artist, and I kind of wanted to travel. So I got this opportunity to stay in India with an American friend who was teaching there. So I sold my house and I bought a ticket to India, and I stayed there for 3 months. Here are some symbols from the Coheed and Cambria graphic novel that kind of inspired me to express myself in a graphic novel with science fiction. And it's kind of odd to point out how much this whole keyworks configuration reminds me of the polar configuration. Looking back, it's always interesting when you gain new perspectives. Traveling there certainly was a trek, and it was an adventure, to be sure. I'd never really been in such a crowded city. I went to Chennai, and it was pretty warm there. Not too bad compared to the desert, just a little bit more humid. But I could go on about everything I experienced there, and I can look back and learn so much more every day. It's beautiful, and I love the food, and I love the temples. We were right next to the beach. I'm not quite sure why I'm showing you all these pictures here. We certainly have other videos that could focus more on this stuff, but I think I just wanted to have a brief flash for this part of the story. Because after 3 months, I headed home, and it was back to the grind. I found a nice soul-crushing job, and I worked overnights for a lot of the past decade. And eventually I wanted to build my own place, and I decided to build a ship. And I looked around the town, and I looked around everywhere for some land, and I found what I could. And I took me and my family, my mom, and moved up here to the northern part of Arizona. By then, in my late 20s, it seemed like most of my friends had all started drifting away from each other and making their own families, so I figured this was the perfect time to start building my own place, or start getting the things ready to build my own place. And I soon found a few jobs in the area when I wanted to make my career. And I was working there during the most recent pandemic, and it was a medical facility, so we were really good about knowing about cross-contamination. But during the years, a lot of things changed. A lot of people's lives changed. I lost both my grandparents before and during that time. And I think a lot of people were trying to wake up and really think about what's most important for life, that it doesn't last very long. Slowly, I think people are coming to that conclusion and starting to really think about what they want in life. And I did too. I was spending so much time working overtime, and eventually it wasn't getting me any closer to finishing my build or starting my build. I couldn't stop and enjoy anything. There was just so much noise and clutter, and the more money I made, the more expenses there were. And in the thick of it all, I found this one idea. And since I'm not worried about the time, and I'm not trying to rush myself, I'm gonna make you guys listen to this video too, because I thought this guy put it best. And as I say, I don't know anything, and if I can't describe it as well as these people and I have the chance to put them in here, I will, because everything we're trying to describe is very ineffable. And once I learn to say it better, I will. But I stumbled across what I'm going to call this keystone, this 4-corner quadrant framework of thought, or graph, of the 5 laws of stupidity.
This is an article that was written by an Italian economic historian, a guy called Carlo M. Cipolla. And he wrote this article in the 1970s, and he died in the late 90s. And there's very little information about this guy online, apart from the fact that he wrote this article. But I found it a very thought-provoking article. It's one of those articles that is written in a slightly humorous way, so the kind of way where the author could potentially claim that this was just them joking, but actually you can tell that he's making a serious point in the article as well. And I'll put a link in the show notes to the article so you can read it yourself. But I want to share with you the ideas in this article. So in the article, Carlo Cipolla puts forward this theory of stupidity, and he puts it forward as 5 laws. So I'll explain each of the laws, and then I'll finish by giving some of my own thoughts on the ideas. The first law of stupidity is that everyone underestimates the number of stupid people. And the idea here is that no matter how many idiots you think you are surrounded by, you are lowballing the estimate. And his argument is the reason that you underestimate how many stupid people there are around you is because you're probably assuming that people are intelligent based on superficial and irrelevant criteria, like their job, their education level, their class, their race, whether or not they're eloquent, and other biases that you may have about assuming that if somebody is a certain way, that means they're not stupid. And he's arguing in this article that you're wrong. Those things are all irrelevant. So that brings us on to law number 2 of stupidity. And that is that the probability that a person is stupid is independent of any other characteristic. So the idea here is that every characteristic that you can imagine, whether it's gender, race, nationality, education level, income, any category you can imagine is uncorrelated to whether or not a person is stupid. And Cipolla even says in this article, there are stupid Nobel Prize winners. So you can't predict whether a person is stupid or not by looking at any of these other characteristics that they might have. His argument is that there are stupid people in every walk of life, in every ethnic group, gender, class, profession, income level, anything you can imagine. And he goes on to argue that there's the same proportion of stupid people in any of these categories because it's uncorrelated to any of these categories. He makes the argument that he can't tell exactly how high that proportion is because everyone underestimates it all the time. But the main point is, you can't use these other criteria to determine whether or not someone is stupid. And that brings us on to law number 3. And this is his idea that a stupid person causes losses to others without gains to themselves. So he's defining stupid behavior as a social thing, and he's saying it's about whether or not you cause losses to other people without benefiting yourself. So it's a social theory of stupidity, and it means that you can still be stupid if you are very good at, for example, mathematical calculations or pattern matching or lots of other things. You could be very good at all of these things, but you're still stupid if your behavior towards others involves losses to other people without you actually gaining. So in order to explain this idea, Cipolla creates this 2x2 matrix. So you have 2 variables and 2 different possible states of each variable, which gives you 4 possible outcomes. So just to explain these variables, so one variable is, are you causing benefits to other people or are you causing losses to other people? So that's the first variable, is your impact on others. Do you benefit them or do you cause them losses? And the second variable is, for yourself, are you benefiting yourself or are you causing losses to yourself? And if you combine those two, we get 4 different outcomes. So talking them through, first of all, you have people who benefit other people and themselves. And this is the win-win outcome, where your actions in the world not only benefit you, but they also benefit other people, and you are a net positive wealth generator in the world. And Cipolla calls these intelligent people. So it's a theory of intelligence based on your behavior, your social behavior. Are you engaging in win-win interactions? So that's the first one. Well, what about the people who cause losses to other people but benefits to themselves? Well, Cipolla calls these bandits, and these are essentially criminals and thieves. If you imagine, when somebody steals, what they're doing is they're causing a loss to you and a gain to themselves. So that's the second type. And then if you imagine there's a third type, which is people who cause benefits to others and losses to themselves. And Cipolla calls these helpless people. And there are other words that I've seen used. He sometimes calls them naive people. The idea here is that this is people who get taken for a ride. They benefit other people, but at a loss to themselves. And then the fourth group is what he defines as stupid people. And these are people who cause losses to others without benefiting themselves. And his idea is that a lot of the time, they're just messing things up for other people without any particular benefit to themselves. But there are also really stupid people who not only cause losses to others, but actually harm themselves actively. So stupid people are either just messing things up for everyone else without any clear gain, or even messing things up for everyone else and actually harming themselves as well in the process. And that's his theory of stupidity. That's what stupid behavior is. And of course, since this is 4 different outcomes from 2 variables, you can draw one of these 4x4 matrices that entrepreneurs love. And someone's done this. I've put it in the show notes. So you can see if you have on the x-axis loss or benefit to yourself, and on the y-axis loss or benefit to others, then in the top right-hand corner you have the intelligent people who benefit themselves and others. Then in the bottom right-hand corner you have the bandits who benefit themselves but cause losses to others. And then in the top left you have the helpless or naive people, or sometimes called hapless people, who benefit others but not themselves. And then in the bottom left quadrant you have the stupid people who harm others and harm themselves. I'll put that graphic in the show notes so you can see it. An interesting part of his law number 3 about defining stupid people is that he also assumes that stupid people are consistent in being stupid. In other words, they go through life constantly causing losses to other people without clear gain to themselves. So it's an interesting idea that he's putting forward, that this is not just one-off behavior. There are people who are basically messing the world up through their stupidity, and they're consistent about it. So law number 4 of stupidity, according to Cipolla, is the idea that non-stupid people underestimate the danger of the stupid. And his argument is that non-stupid people constantly forget that at all times and all places and under any circumstances, to deal with and or associate with stupid people always turns out to be a costly mistake. And his argument here is that everyone underestimates just how dangerous stupid people are. Intelligent people underestimate it, but so do bandits and so do helpless people. And that brings us on to law number 5. And this is the most interesting, I think. Stupid people are the most dangerous people on the planet. And as part of that law, a corollary of that is that stupid people are more dangerous than bandits. And the argument is that if you have someone who is a criminal, a bandit, who wants to gain for themselves by robbing you or by causing losses to you, that person is predictable because they are following incentives. And they may be unethical incentives, they may be doing something that is fundamentally wrong, but at least you can work out what they're likely to do because they have goals and they follow incentives. So bandits you can defend against because you can work out what a bandit might try and do to rip you off. The really dangerous thing about stupid people is that they mess things up for everyone else without clear gain to themselves. And that means they're not following incentives. They're just causing problems. So they're fundamentally unpredictable, and that makes them incredibly dangerous. Even more dangerous than the people who you would identify as the real villains in the world. Stupid people are more dangerous than villains. So that's a summary of the article. As I said, I'll put a link in the show notes if you want to read the original, and I'll put a link to that graphic showing the 4x4 matrix of stupid people versus non-stupid people. It's a very interesting article, and I found it very thought-provoking. I like the idea of defining stupidity in terms of social behavior, because I have met very highly educated people who are very eloquent and articulate, who are also stupid in the way that this article describes. And I think it's really important to bear in mind that if you walk into a room full of highly articulate, educated people, there are going to be destructively stupid people in that group, and you shouldn't assume that just because people are highly educated or articulate that they're not stupid. And by the same token, if you walk into a room of people who are ignorant, who are uneducated, you shouldn't assume that they're destructively stupid in the way that Cipolla defines in this article, because the two are uncorrelated. You can have ignorant people who are not stupid, and you can have highly educated people who are stupid. The idea that stuck with me most in this article, that I've really been mulling over, is this idea that stupid people are the most dangerous people in the world because of their unpredictability. Cipolla argues in this article that we can do nothing about the stupid. And he makes the basic argument that you can't teach stupid people. You can teach ignorant people and they can learn, but his argument is that there are people who cause havoc for everyone else regardless of learning the facts. And his basic idea is that with stupid people, they just throw a spanner in the works for everyone else, and you just basically have to avoid them. And in the end of the article, he makes some comments about what this means for society. This is where the fact that he was a historian came in. He started talking about how much impact do stupid people have on the rise and fall of civilizations. And basically his argument is the stupid people are always there. They're not what determines things collapsing. What determines whether or not societies are able to flourish is how the non-stupid people behave. And basically, what proportion of the non-stupid people are behaving intelligently, involved in win-win interactions with each other, and what proportion of them become bandits and start doing win-lose interactions with other people. And he makes the point that once the non-stupid people stop kind of containing the impact of stupid people, everything goes to hell. So essentially, for society to thrive, his argument is you've got to keep the non-stupid people acting ethically, acting in an intelligent way, which is win-win. His argument is that although you have villains, or bandits as he calls them, people who are out to benefit themselves by robbing others, those people can cause enormous damage because they can lead stupid people in bad ways. Also, they can just unleash the force of stupidity, which can wreck things for everyone else. I don't think this idea is entirely foolproof. I'm still mulling it over myself, and I do see some problems with this idea. I mean, you can get down to nitpicking about, oh, well, how do you define whether a stupid person really isn't benefiting themselves? Because, I mean, you could say, for example, that a suicide bomber is doing something completely stupid because it harms other people and it also harms themselves. But then from that suicide bomber's own perspective, they obviously believe that they benefit from killing themselves. So they could have their own subjective gains in mind. And I do see some other problems with the arguments. And as I said, I get the sense that he was partly joking around by writing this article, but that he was definitely making a serious point as well. And it's one that I'm mulling over. I found it a very thought-provoking read. And I think the idea of thinking about the difference between bandits and stupid people, between people who are truly evil and out to cause harm to others in order for their own gain, thinking about the difference between them and people who just wreck things for everyone else without clear gain to themselves, that is a fascinating thing to consider, and to consider just how dangerous stupid people are. And also to think about his argument that he provocatively puts forward, that there are way more people who behave in this socially stupid way than you think. That's an interesting idea too. So I hope you found that interesting, and I hope that gives you food for thought.
So that was pretty interesting, and I know it was really harsh on stupid people, but it was a better take on the whole idea. It seems like it's a better approach to me. I don't know, do your own research, look it up, read some books. I don't know anything. But I was very intrigued at this polarization, or this keystone quadrant of stupidity, and I decided to try to work on myself with it. And one thing I was getting stuck on was trying to learn how not to be so passive-aggressive. So I kind of dipped around through psychology while I was dealing through my own stuff with pressures from work and home. And I stumbled across the next keystone in the attachment style theories. Let me just say it was a pretty deep revelation to myself, so if you're not prepared to handle this stuff, please be warned. This may be graphic, and it may be a lot to handle, and it may be very reflective into your own self. And I think that's the biggest draw to the attachment theory, is I found so much truth when reading the actual book. But here's a quick summary that couldn't do it justice enough, but I had to include it since I'm taking my time to waste your time. And I hope you're enjoying yourself.
Attachment theory, originated by psychologist John Bowlby in 1968, is one of the fundamental tenets of positive psychology. It posits that people form models of social relationships called attachment styles, based on their early experiences with their parents or primary caregivers and how responsive they were to their needs. This has resulted in 4 major attachment styles: secure, dismissive avoidant, anxious preoccupied, and disorganized. Generally, they can be described like this. 1. Secure is when needs were usually wholly satisfied at an early age, so you believe people are good and trustworthy. You feel worthy of love. 2. Dismissive avoidant, or for simplicity just avoidant, is when there was neglectful parenting from childhood. You see others negatively, but yourself positively, resulting in believing you can only trust yourself. 3. Anxious preoccupied, also known as ambivalent attachment style, is when needs were not always satisfied in childhood. You grow up overvaluing love and doubting your own self-worth. 4. Disorganized is found when the child is raised in an abusive, traumatic, and chaotic home environment. Individuals with this style are believed to be extremely traumatized, emotionally numb, and have no sense of safety or security anywhere. It's also called insecure attachment. So with that said, Let's dive deeper and talk about the 6 ways your attachment style affects your life. 1. Your relationships. Insecure attachment style people have a hard time forming and maintaining meaningful relationships, since they tend to recreate unhealthy patterns from childhood into adulthood. It's generally human nature to seek out the familiar, even if it is negative, because familiar equates to comfort. Avoidants are hesitant to get close to people and have trouble with long-term commitment due to their strong fears of abandonment. They keep their partner somewhat distant so that they can leave before they're left. Conversely, people who've had an anxious, resistant attachment style are desperate for love and intimacy. They hold tight to their partners and are dependent, clingy, and insecure. They tend to distrust others, so they may become jealous and controlling. 2. Your friendships. People who are secure tend to be friendlier and more outgoing. Making friends is relatively easier for them. On the other hand, avoidant children tend to play by themselves and don't bond much with their friends or family, while anxious children become highly sensitive to rejection and may grow up to be people pleasers and conformists who crave social approval and popularity. 3. Your partner. We tend to find partners who resemble our parents, regardless of how negative the parent-child relationship was. Having an avoidant style results in gravitation towards people who are also emotionally unavailable and neglectful of your needs, whereas anxious style individuals are likely to chase those who are inconsistent in their affection, leaving them being the one putting 100% of the effort needed to maintain the relationship. In fact, studies show that having an anxious, avoidant, insecure attachment style makes you more likely to stay in an abusive relationship. 4. Your parenting. It can be hard to outgrow the psychological scars that a dysfunctional family dynamic can leave. Emotionally well-adjusted individuals often cite growing up in a healthy home environment to be the reason behind their happiness and success. Avoidants may grow up to become emotionally distant parents who don't know how to satisfy their child's needs for closeness and comfort. They may overemphasize independence and self-sufficiency, teaching their children that they can't count on other people to be there for them all the time. Meanwhile, parents with an anxious resistant attachment style are the most likely to parent via smothering. They're usually controlling, strict, and overbearing as caregivers. And 5. Your worldviews. Our parents are our first teachers. One of their initial lessons teaches us how we deserve to be treated and how we can expect other people to treat us. Secure style people are more open and trusting because they were raised to see the good in people. They can easily connect with others and feel comfortable being intimate or affectionate. Dismissive avoidant people are doubtful and wary of others. Their perspective is that the world can be a cold and unforgiving place. Anxious preoccupied people believe that the problem lies in themselves, so they tend to be clingy, self-sabotaging, and have low self-esteem, and seek constant reassurance. Your early childhood experiences and relationships with your parents can do much to shape who you are, what you believe, and how you act towards others. Do you see your own attachment style reflected in any of these points made today? Does this help you move closer to understanding those around you and why they might do what they do? Please like and share this video with someone who could benefit from it. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.
So as you can see, I just wanted to speed through this, but the core idea of the thought in these quadrants, and I've read this book a couple of times and I've got to read it more, and I can't recommend it enough. It used to be free on Spotify, it's not anymore, but you'll be able to find it. But these quadrants were really changing the way I approached myself and life, and it seemed like they are core concepts based on trust. Whether you trust yourself or other people, or not, or more or less, I guess, and that fear pushed you more to being disorganized or less trusting. And it seems the solution for this was compassion, love, trust, trying to trust people more than you usually would. Maybe not to an extreme, naive way, but it's something I decided to work on. The quadrants seem to be rotated, but they fit pretty well. I figured there were nuances and there's ways everybody could learn to connect with this. And I focused in on working harder so that, of course, I could build my life again. But things went a lot of different ways, and soon I was at risk of losing my vehicle, which when you live out in the boonies, that is your livelihood. If you lose that, your ability to make it work is drastically lowered. And in these days, it's been even a little bit worse trying to land. In a transition period, I found the electric universe theory. Right before I lost my vehicle, I stumbled upon it, and then afterwards I learned all about the keystone in it. And I included this video just to show how it harkens back to what Alan Watts was saying at the beginning, and how coincidentally we all seem to be attracted and listen to the same people when they speak genuinely. And it's all in trying to keep me in the idea of zenning this and trying to be calm and let things flow and look for the best possible outcome and understand those who struggle with obtaining those.
So, welcome to the great adventure. In fact, every time I sign a book, I say, welcome to the adventure, because that's it. This is the greatest adventure you can have, to discover our real place in the universe. For me, for a general audience, it's difficult for me to talk about, actually, because I never quite know how to get the message across, because a lot of what I say is so unfamiliar if you watch standard television science programs. And I say some outrageous things which give cognitive dyspepsia, as I call it, to those who are experts. But the good thing is that to us, because what we are presenting is a coherent story of the universe, which not only talks about the physics, but it has a huge cultural significance as well. Because Velikovsky, who's perhaps the chief inspiration for my life's work, pointed out towards the end of his life that it's the cultural story which is most important for humanity's survival. Even the great Dr. Carl Jung recognized that humanity is his or hers worst enemy. And the reason is that we have forgotten our past. We suppress memories that arise because it seems that there is such a thing as a racial memory. And in doing so, we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again and pushing down our real understanding of the universe. So I'll try and whip through this because I covered some of the aspects, of course, in that unscheduled earlier talk. Sabine Hossenfelder is a theoretical physicist in quantum gravity, and she writes a blog, Back Reaction it's called, and because she's so well qualified, she has a lot of people who are similarly well qualified who get into the discussion with her. She recognises that things are in desperate trouble in science. And she said, I don't think crisis describes the current situation well, because crisis is optimistic. It means we'll find out a simple answer, a simple fix. It's not that simple. She said, we already know that the theorists' guesses did not work out. And she says, not a single one. And she goes on to say, the self-reflection in the community is zero, zilch, nada, nicht, null. They just keep doing what they've been doing for 40 years. And this is a problem in that science is taught with no reference to understanding how the human brain works and how we are somewhat crippled in doing science by not understanding ourselves. As I said earlier, we have a monologue instead of a dialogue. And to advance, you must have a dialogue. You've got to have somebody asking awkward questions which make you think. Think about whether the things you're saying make sense or whether they fit with the broader picture, because cosmology, a real cosmology, should be able to offer some sensible answer to any question on any subject. Otherwise, it is not a real cosmology. Cosmology is supposed to be the umbrella under which all of our understanding exists. Right now, it has no connection. That umbrella is, lost Mary Poppins, it's off. So we need a new cosmology, and to begin with, to do that, we need new wisdom. And when it comes to wisdom, if you like, a critical view of science, the best people to look to are some of the top cartoonists and also people like John Cleese.
And what I realize at 75 now is that almost nobody has any idea what they're talking about.
I felt very strongly about that because I'm practically a contemporary of John Cleese. There was another fellow who I came across in the early 1980s, another polymath, a British member of Mensa who had wide-ranging ideas, and he wrote this book, The Cult of the Expert, and pointed out how it was actually working against science. And he talks about, blah, blah, blah from the expert. And as I said earlier, the language of modern physics is practically meaningless because most of these significant underpinnings are missing. And as I said, energy and mass, for instance, are undefined.
And so, my folks, this is when I became conscious of the cognitohazard, the black hole in our collective conscious of the universe. Indeed, they were the ones who introduced me first to the concept of the keystones, the key configurations, and the quadrant thinking and everything. And I had to go back and I had to rethink all of the science fiction I had laid out in my mind for my graphic novel. And now I was stuck at home, but my sense of adventure was awakened and on fire more than it had been in the past decade of being an adult. And I was stuck, but I had maps I could look at. I had things to compare. I had geology to look at. All their keystones were just amazing. The way they showed how it integrated with electric geology, which is going to be a separate keystone subject. Because I'm going to have to split the metaphysical aspects from the other one. This is just a long introduction video. I began looking at all the rocks on my land and the fossils and the scars and mountains and canyons on the 3D maps and on Google Earth, and it was just amazing. But I eventually had to look for a job either way. I had quite a few things I went through that were freelancing that really didn't drum up much, and I actually ended up wasting more time and money on most of it, but some things I did learn from it, so it was a complete waste. And here we have our introduction to our next set of keystones, which were a little bit more complicated to arrange and overlay. I even had an AI help me with it when I discovered this, but I discovered this going through this seminar training for this online sales company, which some people call a cult because they're more focused on recruiting than actual sales. And if I had more means, it would be a better opportunity, but I decided to go against it, and because it would have drained a lot more of my time, even just waiting for them to hand me the contract. And so anyways, they taught me this, which I thought was really important and brought me to my next stage. This is called the cash flow quadrants. And I think for a minute, I'll just let an introduction do a real quick phase for this, because you kind of see where I'm going. The keystone is following us everywhere through this.
Favorite quote from the author: "The single most powerful asset we all have is our mind. If it is trained well, it can create enormous wealth." Robert T. Kiyosaki. Rich Dad's Cash Flow Quadrant explains how people can get rich by working smarter, not harder. The book explains that there are 4 different types of people. 1. Employee, E. 2. Self-employed, S. 3. Business owner, B. 4. Investor, I. The E quadrant represents employees who work for others and provide labor in exchange for a paycheck. The S quadrant represents self-employed people who sell their services to others and keep the profits. The B quadrant represents business owners who own an asset or business that provides income for them. Finally, the I quadrant depicts investors who invest money to gain profits on a regular basis with little effort on their part. Here are 3 of my favorite lessons from the book. 1. People who live off of their hourly labor alone are extremely different from those who invest or have their own business. 2. Truly rich people know that they need to start moving within the B and I quadrants ASAP. 3. Investing is complicated at first, but after analyzing the 5 types of investors, you'll know where you stand. If you loved Kiyosaki's first book, or if you want to learn more about reaching financial independence, you're going to love what's next.
Okay, so if you want to learn more about that, go look that up. Do your homework. The hard part was I couldn't find a nice way to orientate the attachment quadrants over the cash flow quadrants. Somehow, no matter how I rotated it, it seemed like the squares weren't orientated right. And soon it started reminding me of the way that Americans think that we move through our class system, which is also a caste system. So I decided to try to overlay that to this, and me and the AI couldn't agree too much on that either. But I'll get more into the class caste system later. Right now I want to finish out this, so I think after a few debates I just wrote it out and I concluded this, and I think I needed to at least explain myself on this. So it became abundantly clear to me that everybody could have their own opinions and interpretations on this very thing and perspective. So here was mine, and my thinking is employees are preoccupied because they're anxious because they're relying on the business owner. So since they're both a collective engagement, they both belong at least on the same side. And then since self-employed and investor is a self thing, like you're relying on yourself but yet everybody else, but it is an internal kind of exchange. There's the internal external with the self-employed, and the investor, which is internal, which would be investors just randomly or unknowingly investing with business owners. So it was really weird trying to flip fearful or secure for the business owner investor. Me and the AI couldn't agree on that. And business owners really try to do for the best for themselves and at least their employees, or at the very least the investors. So they're always trying to win-win, whether it's ethically or for the higher or lower man or lower class. But we have investors on the other hand, which can be secretive, they can be insecure, they can invest and inflate in a business, a small business takeover, and then just change it completely and ruin it, and then cash out thinking they made investment and money on the way and they don't have to suffer the consequences, but what they leave behind are scars in a world that is less better off for everybody, including them, even though they may not see it that way. But I guess that's just my interpretation or opinion. I was aware of my own biases starting to slip into these comparisons and overlays, and the way they kind of started to tilt their access on each other, and it became very confusing what was what. And I soon found myself lost in how to proceed in comparing these things. Indeed, it seemed before me I had a bunch of causality spheres with no way on how they all orientate and fit together. Or at least, that's what I thought. It became easy to get lost in a rabbit hole, so I needed a new perspective or angle on this. And so I finally did the thing. I did the hermetic thing and I squared the circle, and it multiplied the questions and options like a web. I drew my new idea of core and outer layered, double layered causality. Got lost in the nuances and how many times you can divide these up by all the different points, and it reminded me of Jung's archetypes and all the personality archetypes. And that's where it started to get interesting. Indeed, even Carl Jung, in his quest to rectify spiritual and religious experiences with psychic abilities and superstitions, led to him talking and studying a lot about squaring the circle. And from here, the archetypes just branch out more. There's so much more overlaying and comparisons we can do, even to the zodiac, which they line up nicely, circles, 12 points. Have you ever participated in astrology or learned your astrological signs? Have you ever taken a personality test? Well then, you may have participated in a keystone quiz. There are also examples of these beautiful, ornamental, very symbolic mandalas associated with his publications. And they're beautiful and stunning, and I just want you to think for a minute, have you seen any of these symbols or representations? Or does it remind you of anything you've seen here already? So it was very interesting for something that I thought was a karmic flow and ebb of Zen turn out to have so many different angles opening up with me and so many different uncanny parallels and relations. So is this really just my own bias? Is it my own pattern confirmation? The squares and circles soon became a maze, a distraction. Everywhere I turned, everything I heard was another circle and square and key figure, and it all fit together within the angles. Certainly, they are questions for other videos to expand on. But obviously, there is no limit to how deep or far back that the possible paths of this knowledge can go, and the things that we can learn and uncover about the world overlaying such ideals. But it just soon became an infinite onion. And all I really wanted to do simply was journey through geology, but since good questions in geology became so hard to ask, I had to follow these alternative paths. Now it was like a maze of paths all leading to the same, more or less concentric rabbit hole. Just circles and squares, and honestly, it's a lot to get lost on, but I want to focus on this key concept and finish out the one of the mind, the Zen games, and the keystone key works. And so I'd like to go back into the fact that the cash flow system reminded me of the caste and class. So we're convinced that we are very different from the caste system and the American side. And so I just want to refresh us on what the Indian class is and then show it in my diagram. And again, I couldn't agree with the AI of how to place this quadrant configuration, and it couldn't even agree with itself and kept changing it up. So I had to draw it out. Interesting notes is, first off, we get sometimes different positions, and people ascribe to these different quadrants sometimes. And also we get an outside variable, an odd number. And sometimes it looks like there were two different classes of outsiders. As we would say today, outcasts, people who don't fit in. At least with the dominant paradigm. The common sub-outcast group is the untouchables, because they are not part of the creator in the caste system, and they are usually unpaid labor. We know what that means. And then there is people trying to fight for their homelands and do not agree with the monarchy or the system coming in. Those would be like dissonants, so we have the two different groups of outcasts. So at this point, we should ask ourselves, we should look back and wonder if what we're being told is true to antiquity. How do these caste systems work in ancient times across different civilizations? How do they integrate themselves? And how do they change? When I was in India, I decided to look up the history of Buddhism on the internet, and if you study it, you learn that Buddhism branched out from Hinduism after India was taken over by another country. And it started increasing tariffs and payments on all the religious practices that were integrated into everyday life. Thus, Buddhism sprung out because it's exactly identical, but they didn't have to pay any priests to come by to their house every day, which they couldn't afford anymore. So it was people being pushed out of the functional caste because of the taxes and stuff on the system. Wowee. Now ask yourself, how do we look at these systems, view these systems, organize them, and use them today in society? Are they also being used to infiltrate and corrode and disrupt societies? Good question. If anybody can remember being taught this in school, do you remember them referring to the medieval caste system? And when you look at this example and the supposed difference between, can you tell how the pyramid is 4 layers, and so is, both pyramids are 4 layers, but one is distinctly 3 different labels, while the other one also avoids the entire that was around in the medieval times, building all of their great monuments and cathedrals. Should we compare the people in them to each other and across from different pyramids? When we look at the one on the right, why is the guy at the top in a brown trench coat with glasses and a top hat, while the guy at the bottom is in almost the same trench coat, hunched position, no hat, glasses? It's very interesting, isn't it? Let's look at another interpretation. Here we have a 5-layer pyramid in 3 distinct levels by these two borders inside and one distinct one at the top, as if there's a limit to the top of the pyramid, but there's no limit to falling out of that bottom. Very interesting. This would be a very common American view on our class system, almost economically speaking. Now we have a really dull one, being the socialist caste system. So this one's more based on status and celebrity, of course. So this is like a really dumbed down American version of people who probably are barely familiar with this idea in the American way. By our use of words, we can tell the perspectives, and this really just seems like a stairway to an absent door, an empty portal. And I apologize, but this is the most vain and simplified I can make the American Western ideals of class caste systems, how we try to tell ourselves are different. And I have to bring us back down to earth and show us a perspective, a ground perspective of the Indian caste system, because I know this subject is hard, it's sensitive to talk about, and who am I, right? So it's good to bring in a perspective from someone who has actually lived there.
The first time I knew that I was inferior, I probably was 18 months old. I knew that we were untouchables. Untouchability means actually untouchability. You cannot touch them. Caste is a forced occupation based on your birth. When I first came to America, people treated me equally. In fact, even in the beginning, I used to feel, what if they touch me? They're going to be polluted. One time, a boyfriend of mine was eating from something that I already touched, and he was going there, and I said, no, stop, I touched it, and his heart broke, like, you're not in India anymore. Hinduism more or less is an ideological, religious prop for this social system that is caste. Brahma, the creator, the Brahmins are supposed to have come from the forehead, and the Kshatriyas from the arms, merchant caste from the thighs, service caste from legs. And untouchables are not part of any of Brahma, the creator. What makes them untouchable is they are assigned hereditary duties that are considered filthy and menial by the Indian society. Like the hardest jobs are theirs and the filthiest jobs are given to them. Based on these different occupations, there are about, in my area, 52 different subcastes within untouchability. And my family is called Mala. Mala means people who do agricultural labor. And there are others who do like removing dead animals, burning the dead people, and carrying away human My stories, my family stories, were not stories in India. They were just life. Your life is your caste is your life. At 26, I came to America, where people know only skin color. Only in talking to some friends I met here did I realize that my stories, my family stories, are not stories of shame. It's not healed. It is not healed. The advice I give to untouchables that are still in India, I think that the best thing they can do is get jobs like I have in a crucial industry like MTA. We don't work, then everything comes to a screeching halt. And it really gives a sense of like, yes, your services are crucial to the society. That gives me a lot of self-confidence that I didn't have. I'm not going to be like saying America is great, but yeah, for untouchables, yeah, it is. And for me, it's like pop music, Madonna, Bob Dylan, and it's intellectually free world. It's an escape for us. I would be judged by my nationality, but not by my caste. That gave me courage to think, what is untouchability and why am I an untouchable? I don't think there's any other solution for caste than demolishing the existing structure, because caste had a particular economic function, and that's the purpose it served, division of labor. This is not a kind of thing that I can say, oh, change your minds and stuff. You break the structures that necessitate this sort of exploitation. Unless you break the structures, this is all going to be a band-aid on a bullet wound.
Now that I know that's a lot to take in, and a lot of people may have a lot of polarizing ideas about what they may have just watched, but I want to focus on how much it took for that lady to make her way over here. Now, as an American, getting your passport, getting a visa to a country takes a little bit, and it takes a little bit of money, but it's very doable. In fact, even if you don't have the visa, most countries, if you land in most countries with an American passport, you're mostly granted a 30-day visa stamp. So you won't usually have to get a whole month, year-long specific visa if you're just popping around for a bit. But on the other hand, people in other countries, like say India, who knows all the hoops they have to jump through to get their passport in the first place. And then once they get their passport and applying for a visa to America, who knows how many hoops they have to jump through to get into that. But after they apply for it, it goes into a lottery. And who knows if they win the lottery or not, if they get the money back, or if they go into the next one. So it is a very, very hard system. And you only know this if you travel and talk to people. A lot of different countries participate in different programs all the time for people traveling from other countries to come live and work. There's a Sardinia opening right now for Americans to go and buy $1 houses with a lot of different constituents on the deal. And I see other things all the time. And I saw some for Australia for engineers from India while I was in India. So unbeknownst to everybody else, this does happen all the time. Concentrating and moving people. It is very crucial to the world dynamic and economic system. But what does this all have to do with the class and caste system of America? Isn't ours different? Isn't it based on different things? And it's based on the economy? What about the quadrant model of our American economy? Well, let's look at that one more time before we see what they really try to distract us with when we all try to get together on a conclusion about how this system is, should, and does work. We should overlay it and think it out for a second, though. Now, if we compare a caste system to the attachment styles or the gauge of stupidity, we realize, is it really that logical to assign our birth paths from life to death based upon our attachment styles, which develop over time and mirror our parents, which can be totally different from our parents, meaning we're not born into attachment styles. We're born into either secure, taking care of families, or you're born in fear, or you're born in insecurity. And it's interesting to see how our personalities spiral out of this. And so you can't just judge people, into their caste by their personality, which can change with perspective and time. I mean, have we really changed? Are we really creating functional social caste system and not pushing people fear or insecurity into a whole nother outside caste while pushing everybody else into the same one? When we are humans are so diverse and layered, obviously, by this key system, but we fit together. And again, here is somebody else whose words and stuff are probably more qualified to describe what I'm trying to get at here, and I don't really know why this point is so hard to get across besides the distractions and the misleads we get with this. And here's a good example. I figured since this lady wrote the book on the American caste system currently, it seems to be pretty popular, so I'd interject it here.
Thank you for having me. As I said, the new book is Caste, The Origin of Our Discontents. It came out 2 years ago, but it's now out in paperback. The New York Times Review called it the keynote nonfiction book of the American century thus far. For those who don't know, explain the concept of caste and how you perceive that within our own cultural context.
Well, first of all, caste is essentially an arbitrary, artificial, graded ranking of human value in a society. Any society, and we often think of that word applied to India, you know, the most recognizable caste system in the world. And yet it turned out that our founding fathers actually replicated or created a parallel kind of hierarchy. But what they did was you could use any number of metrics to create a caste system. You could use religion, you could use ethnicity, you could use immigrant status, language, all of that. But in our country, what the colonists chose to use was the metric of what people look like, meaning race. So race was the tool that was used to divide and to rank people, to determine who would be slave or free, who could own property or who could be property. And we still live with the after effects of that.
Okay, so you use a metaphor that I like. Please explain this. You got this metaphor to sort of explain living within a caste system.
Yeah, well, one metaphor that I love so much is the metaphor of this old house.
So I need to pause here because she makes a really interesting metaphor that in which she says some key words that I think people like Lucius and John Levi and Autodidactic and Paul Cook and My Lunch Break and all those guys in the alternative research would really pick up on. But it's really interesting to hear this lady say this stuff. And it reminds me of why we think they reset history and get rid of the old stuff and they move people around and it's all in the old heritage of our forefathers.
I see myself as the building inspector of this old house we call America. And if anyone has an old house, they know that the work is never done in an old house. You never get a new hot water heater and say, phew, I'll never have to think about that again. There's some owners of the old house around here. And so the work is never done and you don't expect it to. So when you have a country such as ours, a country as old as ours is, we should not be expecting that the work is always done and all done. The other thing about a house as a metaphor for understanding ourselves is that when you take possession of an old house, and I'm the building inspector who's handing you this report, yes, and you take possession of that old house, you are not the one who created those uneven pillars and joists and beams. You're not the one who created the frayed wiring and the corroded pipes. But anything that happens going forward is on you. Any further deterioration is on you. And when you take on the task of taking possession of an old house, you don't get necessarily emotional about it. I mean, you may not love what the report is saying, yeah, but it's not personal. It's not about shame and blame. It's recognizing that this is the situation that we're in. This is our inheritance as Americans, inheritance if you take possession of an old house. And it's up to us to roll up our sleeves and get to work and do whatever it takes to fix this old house. Look at all those systems, overhaul those systems, do whatever it takes to fix those systems so that it can remain standing for generations to come.
There's an attack reminds us that caste is not really, in fact, about black or white. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, we're accustomed to the polarity of black versus white in our country.
So this is solely a racial conversation.
We're accustomed to seeing it when the people involved look a certain way at the extremes of the polar configurations in our country. But what the Tyree Nichols case shows us so tragically is that you do not have to be in the dominant group, the dominant caste, in order to do its bidding. That we all have been exposed to and programmed to recognize what the hierarchy is, whose lives are valued and whose lives are so devalued that anyone in any group, including one's own, can attack you. And that's what happened to him. And so that to maintain a caste system of the hierarchies of where everyone's positioned and to maintain the social order that we are so accustomed to, that's a 400-year-old social order, there are sentinels at every rung. And in that case, that's what they were doing. They were enforcers of the caste system.
Your father built bridges. He said he was an engineer.
Wowee. So that was a lot to take in, and this video is kind of long so far, so I'm not going to let that bother me, but I guess the most I could say about what she was saying is she kind of sidestepped the whole description of the issue and went into this old house and polar configuration talking. And it turned into what the outer class, the outcast, the outside caste is, and didn't really talk about economics or movement within the social structure or anything. I mean, I myself feel lost, maybe a little confused and reorientated, but I wanted to picture out in front of us what I'm trying to get at before we move on to the next parts. And this is what I got so far. If your different personality style constitutes, you know, what job you're best fit for and how your outcomes affect you in the world, and maybe you can change that, then why do we keep trying to cast people in ones and outcast them for trying to move around, or we put people above the entire caste system or completely out of the caste system? And that lady definitely talked about more about what made you outcast or above caste than anything to do within the caste, because the caste is the square, the 4. Anytime you add something uneven to it, it seems to imbalance it. And if you try to reorientate or reposition things in it as a power structure, or how they interact with each other, you start to lose the integrity of the stability of the structure. And when the path to movement becomes blocked or obscured, there are many reasons to question why we have fractioned this into so many different areas and ideas when they all seem very correlated. And I'm going to show you the correlations I find when I do try to extrapolate it like this. So if we look at this cash flow quadrant representation, it tells us how to move through the supposed cash flow quadrants, i.e. economic caste class systems, means of making money. So you go from employee to self-employed to, you know, from working for other people to working for yourself, making your own money, to eventually growing that to a big business, to eventually either selling out or becoming an investor in your own and other businesses. It creates like a Z pattern, and we can arrange that as a pyramid. So here's the pyramid structure of how our capital class sees movement through the caste system. And at the top right, or the top middle, is my interpretation of it, my perspective. And I think what I found interesting is when I tried to mirror the movement of the cash flow quadrant over my quadrant, the way I decided to configure it, I got an interesting little movement. And this looks even more confusing, and it's a lot more steps. And you can note that I just had to move the investors and the employees to quadrants next to each other, because it seems like there's a lot of ways where some quadrants don't want to have other quadrants next to each other. But you might say, Jesse, why is this important? This is just your opinion or this perspective. And believe me, I know that. I tried to look for a lot of different ways to look at this. And the reason why I did the quadrants in this polar configuration and this orientation, it's because I did research it, you know, and it brought me to quadrant thinking. Two separate sides with two separate variable outcomes, making a 4-quadrant between the inner self and the outer self, and the inner collective and the outer collective. So what is the internal X, and what is the external? What is the self, and what is the other? We're all connected. And this reminds me of the alchemy saying, as above, so below, as within, so without. So if we take a look again at this entrepreneur's cash flow quadrant, we have at least one bar, one side to the other, doing passive income or active income. And then we look at the other crossing variable from top down, or is it a collective endeavor, or is it a completely mostly contained endeavor? So investors and self-employed people would land on that side, and, you know, employees and business owners are very self-intertwined, so they belong on the side together. So their collaboration in this kind of makes sense. So why did I make a different one? So in my quadrant theory of the internal, the external, or the outside, and the self and the collective, this is how they fell in. The investors fell into the eternal self, and the self-employed turned into the external self, because they externally have their services and labor. And the employee is a collective on the self, the internal, and the business owner is the outer collective. So now when we look at these caste works that put somebody above the whole entire system, or these other ones that are even outdated to where they're not even represented well, but they still make sure to keep one caste out of the entire system, even though these people still have their own individual attachment, personalities, and skills that differ amongst each other. And they do, no matter what, we all have to work together in this charged quadrant dynamic, and we're all human, and we're all corralled by fear and family and generational trauma to different personalities and different masks and layers of all this. We're just looking for an opportunity, and we don't want to be judged by that. At least in America, we believe we're not. At this point in the video, I hope that at the very least I've made you aware of the overlay and relations between this stupidity article and the Jung archetypes and the personality archetypes and its relations to the attachment styles, which we all have, unless you're either brain dead or psychopathic or lacking empathy, psychotic, But anyways, we all need to eat, so we all need to make money, and we all need to get a job. So what do we all think about the companies widely using different personality assessments for their hiring process? It was hard to find some information, but we're going to segue to some people talking about that for a minute.
So the big benefit of personality questionnaires that no one talks about is that they are the perfect tool to offset the weaknesses of interviews. So what I mean by that is, realistically, from the research, interviews are just social skills tests, okay? If you are super charismatic, you will do better. That is it. You know, if you have great social skills, if you're very interpersonally aware, if you're very charismatic and charming, you will do better at interviews. And as a result, what the interviewer is trying to measure, say resilience or work ethic or organizational skills, these things don't help you in an interview. If you're really organized, it does not help you at all when talking to someone and explaining how good you are as an employee. So what happens is the charismatic candidate convinces them that they're organized, or the charismatic candidate convinces them that they are resilient, irrespective of how they actually are in these constructs. It's the wrong tool. Whereas personality questionnaires and behavioral assessments are designed to measure those explicitly in a way that is not completely obfuscated by charisma. And so if you have a competency framework, if you have behaviors that you are really interested in and you know are indicative of performance and fit in the organization, you are going to need behavioral assessments to measure those. It isn't optional. If those things matter and you want to hire on the basis of them, you cannot rely on interviews to do that. You will need behavioral assessments. Now, the reason they work is that they are designed specifically in line with various models of personality to measure those specific behavioral constructs in a way that is very repeatable, in a way that is very reliable, in a way that you can validate. Because it's a fixed product that you can test on hundreds of people, unlike an interview, which happens once and is a once-off. And so if those things matter, you need to use behavioral assessments. Now, not only do we know that they are useful measures of performance, predictors of performance, you can use them to predict whether someone will be a good employee, ultimately, whether they're going to perform well in the role, whether they will create more widgets per unit time, whether they have a higher sales total, whether their managers will give them higher performance ratings. We know that to be the case. But more than that, we also know them to be especially useful indicators of retention, because employee engagement, job satisfaction, organizational loyalty, fit to the organizational culture and to the role and to the team, these are inherently behavioral. It is about fit to the behavioral requirements and the behavioral capabilities of that person. And so, yeah, the performance is important, but realistically, I think you should be considering quality of hire to be akin to a sort of employee total lifetime value metric. How much performance over their tenure. Both of those things matter, because if you have a high performer who stays for a week, that's a bad hire. Doesn't matter how good they are, it is not enough time for them to add value. And so you need to consider that. It's not just about performance, it's also about retention. And from what we have seen in the research, personality assessments are a much stronger indicator of retention than they are performance, in a way that cannot be replicated elsewhere. And so that is ultimately the goal here, behavioral assessments. It offsets the inherent weaknesses of interviews and allows you to find people who will both perform well and stay for the duration.
Candidates can lie all the time. They're going for a job. They want the job. They want the money. They want the rewards. They can choose to lie or impression manage when they're filling out or completing any form of assessment we use in recruitment. So that includes interviews. That includes group discussions. They can present their best selves. We expect it to go on. With psychometrics, it's really personality assessments where lying and faking and impression management can make a difference. You can decide as a candidate to try and answer the questionnaire in a way that presents you in a really positive light for the employer. But unlike an interview, we can tell. We can include measures within a personality assessment to detect potential efforts to fake or lie when they're filling it in, and those can be followed up. With assessments like interviews, a skilled interviewer can look out for what they feel might be efforts to impression manage or tell the best possible story about yourself. But it's not as easy, and it's really by using psychometrics, although they can be susceptible to lying and faking, at least we have the reassurance that we can detect those sorts of patterns of responding when they happen.
Personality assessment companies are on a mission to convince companies not to use their assessments improperly, especially when it comes to workplace hiring. Two of the most popular assessments, the Enneagram and the Myers-Briggs, which is also known as the MBTI, are produced by companies that say they never want them used in hiring. 32% of HR professionals admitted to using behavioral or personality assessments to select candidates at the executive level. 28% use them to hire middle managers, and 20% to recruit for non-management roles.
To get into saying I'm going to try to hire a certain personality type is doing a disservice to the individual, because that person may be great at the job that they're applying for. They may have the skills to do it. They may do a really good job in that job. Are there companies still using it for hiring? I hope not.
The MBTI assessment should not be used to screen out people. It should not be used in hiring or firing decisions or admitting students to college.
It doesn't predict or measure whether you'll be successful in a job or not. It's not performance-based, and that's not what it's designed to do.
I am aware of organizations that do use the Enneagram for hiring. To use the Enneagram for hiring purposes, it's almost like, well, it's not looking at or considering the person that's behind the number, so to speak.
We use them to box people in to say, you're good at this, you're good at this. And instead of humanizing the workplace, we further objectify the workplace.
The MBTI was created by Isabel Briggs Myers and Catherine Cook Briggs in the 1940s, and more than 2 million people take the assessment every year.
There's probably about 50 million people have probably taken it since it first came out in the 1940s.
The Enneagram is another test that has spiked in popularity in recent years. The Enneagram Institute says its paid online test, The Ready, has grown exponentially. New users increased 38% in 2018 over 2017, and returning users increased more than 40%. Personality practitioners also want to make another thing very clear. These assessments should not be called tests.
There is no right or wrong personality type. It's just you have a preference for one personality type over another. And it's not like we don't use all of the different facets of our personality all the time.
Julie Gross is one such practitioner for the Myers-Briggs assessment. She even helped analyze Stephen Colbert's personality on his show.
So INFP,
Yes.
Is that a good one to get?
Introversion, intuition, feeling, perceiving. It's typically the most brilliant, creative, intellectual minds. People tend to think that other individuals are like themselves and that other groups are like themselves, not understanding fully what your own preference for communication is can limit your ability to modify your own communication style in a way that can be heard.
The culture of your organization can really make or break the success of the company.
Once somebody's on board, to use it as a framework for assimilating a new leader onto a team is a wonderful use of the Enneagram.
I can tell you that there are a lot of personality assessments coming out, and I think one of the core things for people to be looking at is making sure that you're using an assessment that is reliable, valid, and that there is actually data and research to back it up.
Hey friends, Dave Burke is here. Welcome back to the Daily Burke. Today we are talking about personality testing during the hiring or the job interview process. Now this is a follow-up from an episode of the Daily Burke from a couple weeks ago. We'll put a link here or wherever we put links to other episodes so you can see it, because in that episode I mentioned that there's not a whole lot of predictive validity. There are not a lot of studies that can tie certain scores on certain personality tests to who is going to be a better performer or better fit for the job. And that's the truth, but it left a question unresolved, which is, what do you do if a company is asking you to take this test as part of the hiring process? And here's my recommendation. Take it. Take it. Don't stress out about it. Don't try and game the system. Don't try and answer it with the things that you think they want to know. Just take it. You can't really tell when you are looking at a test whether or not it's going to be one of those ones that, as I mentioned in the prior episode, is scoring you on personality dimensions versus trying to be a type indicator and put you in a certain slot. You can't really tell that when you're taking the test. So just take it. Unless you've done your research and you can see what company's logo is at the top, and then you know whether or not this is a scientifically valid test or not, there's not really a lot you can tell in the moment. So take it, be open, be honest, because here's the situation. Number one, if they're giving you a test that is not really all that scientifically valid, it doesn't really matter what your score is, right? Because whether or not they decide you're a fit for the job based on that dynamic, it's kind of irrelevant. They believe there's some predictive validity, but there's probably not. And so you probably don't want to go to work there anyway. So if they exclude you out because of that, then you probably saved yourself a lot of agony. But on the other hand, if they are one of these ones that are based on personality dimension, and they're using it not to make the hiring decision, but to try and figure out maybe where you're best fit in terms of a team, or just know a little bit more about you once they make that hiring decision, then it'd be better off that you are honest. So trust that you're not going to lose a job that you want because of some bogus personality test, because you don't really want the job anyway. Instead, just be open, be honest, take the test, because it's hard to tell what type of test is being used when you're in that hiring moment. So be open and honest with yourself. Don't try and game it. Don't lie. Just take the test. And bonus points if, whether you take the job or not, you can ask for your results after the fact, because that's going to help you figure out whether or not you took a pretty good test or not. So take it, be open, be honest, and ask to see the results yourself. Thanks so much for watching this episode of The Daily Burke. Leave a comment below. Again, let me know if you've ever taken a personality test for work, and also let me know which one it is. I'd love to get some inside ideas on who among our viewers are taking what tests. And while you're leaving that comment, make sure you are followed or subscribed to the show on whatever platform you're watching this in, because we're posting new episodes on that platform every single weekday designed to help you do your best work ever. And I want to make sure that you don't miss it. Thank you again so much for watching The Daily Burke.
Hi, today I had my first experience with personality tests. Basically I'm looking for a new job, and I was asked by an agency to do a personality test, which is fair enough, you know, they want to evaluate where I am and stuff. And so I looked at the name of the test, and it was the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And I remember this from somewhere, and I realized, oh, I read this on the Skeptics Dictionary. And then I remembered, well, you know, basically the test, it's never been through a controlled study, and it may not be necessarily a reliable means of evaluating someone's personality. The problem is that in many workplaces, I think in South Africa, and I know in America quite well, in the corporate world, this test is frequently used in evaluating employees and deciding, you know, whether we should hire this person, and many people get pigeonholed because of this particular test. And my view is that employers or anybody should not be using this test as, you know, a gold standard for evaluating someone when it doesn't really have that much of a scientific basis. And in the scientific community, it's highly disputed. Having said that, that's not to say that there isn't some merit and there might be some relevance, but if employers are taking the results of these tests as gospel, that's a problem. And it means that many people will suffer as a result when you're using unreliable tests to gauge someone's personality. So I just think that employers should look at the whole picture, and they shouldn't just use these tests as a means to evaluate something.
So, even though I found more videos, I couldn't find anything else quite deeper than that. For all intents and purposes, it is cast mostly positive and just slightly neutral, or just maybe completely opposing, but the reasons are always scattered. But what I found really interesting, like you may have noticed, is it reminded me of how the GOAT test was used. Now, see, the GOAT test was a personality test used in Fallout 3, and it was determined your occupation in the vault as a vault dweller, and qualifications for overseers and that kind of junk. And then, as you so have it, when we went over to Fallout 4, there was a settlement who used the GOAT test, same exact questions just about, to determine whether or not somebody was actually a synthetic human or not, with, you know, a slight probability rate. They actually had better job determining people's careers than they did whether somebody was human or synthetic. And we saw the outcomes if we played that game. Pretty interesting. Before I move on. But it shows you the mirror between using it, one, as giving people an occupation, or two, using it as a reason to outcast people to the outside of these casts. But let's continue with what I found next. I'm not sure what else to say. I'm sure we've all taken these tests in these times looking for a job, and I am on to play the game. And what game, you may ask, that is? Well, I finally found the most important square in all of these matrices and personality tests and the way they relate to each other. I found the most important square in the original game theory. And what game is this, you may ask? Well, I don't know, it might go by very many names. It's kind of old, but it is known as the Prisoner's Dilemma. But it reminds me of just the game of life. And I found this one really old game called Midlife Crisis, and it's pretty interesting. I found it in a thrift store here. It kind of has a meditation maze, 4 sections you go around, and the goal is to crack up, get divorced, and go broke, I guess, or make it to the end of your life. I can't remember. It was really interesting. But anyway, here is more on the original game theory, and I think you might find it all pretty interesting.
What? In 1950, the RAND Corporation, a US-based think tank, was studying this question, and as part of this research, they turned to game theory. That same year, 2 mathematicians at RAND had invented a new game, one which, unbeknownst to them at the time, closely resembled the US-Soviet conflict. This game is now known as the Prisoner's Dilemma, so let's play a game. A banker with a chest full of gold coins invites you and another player to play against each other. You each get 2 choices. You can cooperate or you can defect. If you both cooperate, you each get 3 coins. If one of you cooperates but the other defects, then the one who defected gets 5 coins and the other gets nothing. And if you both defect, then you each get a coin. The goal of the game is simple, to get as many coins as you can. So, what would you do? Suppose your opponent cooperates, then you could also cooperate and get 3 coins. Or you could defect and get 5 coins instead, so you are better off defecting. But what if your opponent defects instead? Well, you could cooperate and get no coins, or you could defect and at least get 1 coin. So, no matter what your opponent does, your best option is always to defect. Now, if your opponent is also rational, they will reach the same conclusion and therefore also defect. As a result, when you both act rationally, you both end up in the suboptimal situation, getting 1 coin each, when you could have gotten 3 instead. In the case of the US and Soviet Union, this led both countries to develop huge nuclear arsenals of tens of thousands of nuclear weapons each, more than enough to destroy each other many times over. But since both countries had nukes, neither could use them. And both countries spent around $10 trillion developing these weapons, Both would have been better off if they had cooperated and agreed not to develop this technology further. But since they both acted in their own best interest, they ended up in a situation where everyone was worse off. The Prisoner's Dilemma is one of the most famous games in game theory. Thousands and thousands of papers have been published on versions of this game. In part, that's because it pops up everywhere. Impalas, living in between African woodlands and savannas, are prone to catching ticks, which can lead to infectious diseases, paralysis, even death. So it's important for impalas to remove ticks, and they do this by grooming. But they can't reach all the spots on their bodies, and therefore they need another impala to groom them. Now, grooming someone else comes at a cost. It costs saliva, electrolytes, time, and attention, all vital resources under the hot African sun, where a predator could strike at any moment. So for the other impala, it would be best not to pay this cost. But then again, it too will need help grooming. So all impalas face a choice. Should they groom each other or not? In other words, should they cooperate or defect? That is what Robert Axelrod, a political scientist, wanted to find out. So in 1980, he decided to hold a computer tournament.
He invited some of the world's leading game theorists from many different subjects to submit computer programs that would play each other.
Axelrod called these programs strategies. Each strategy would face off against every other strategy and against a copy of itself. Or not. In other words, should they cooperate or defect? Well, if they only interact once, then the rational solution is always to defect. That other impala is never going to help you, so why bother? But the thing about a lot of problems is that they're not a single prisoner's dilemma. Impalas see each other day after day, and the same situation keeps happening over and over again. So that changes the problem. Because instead of playing the prisoner's dilemma just once, you're now playing it many, many times. And if I defect now, then my opponent will know that I defected, and they can use that against me in the future. So, what is the best strategy in this repeated game? The first to defect. So tit for tat is a nice strategy. It can defect, but only in retaliation. The opposite of nice is nasty. That's a strategy that defects first. So Joss is nasty. Out of the 15 strategies in the tournament, 8 were nice and 7 nasty. The top 8 strategies were all nice. And even the worst performing nice strategy still far outscored the best performing nasty one. The second important quality was being forgiving. A forgiving strategy is one that can retaliate, but it doesn't hold a grudge. So tit for tat is a forgiving strategy. It retaliates when its opponent defects, but it doesn't let defections from before the last round influence its current decisions. Friedman, on the other hand, is maximally unforgiving.
After the first defection, just from the opponent would defect for the rest of the game. Okay, that's it. No mercy. And that might feel good to do, but it doesn't end up working out well in the long run.
This conclusion, that it pays to be nice and forgiving, came as a shock to the experts. Many had tried to be tricky and create subtle, nasty strategies to beat their opponent and eke out an advantage. But they all failed. Instead, in this tournament, nice guys finished first. Now, tit for tat is quite forgiving, but it's possible to be even more forgiving. Axelrod's sample strategy only defects after its opponent defected twice in a row. It was tit for 2 tats. Now, that might sound overly generous, but when Axelrod ran the numbers, he found that if anyone had submitted the sample strategy, they would have won the tournament.
I mean, it's so clever. There's so many layers to this story. After Axelrod published his analysis of what happened, or circulated it among these game theorists, he said, now that we all know what worked well, let's try again.
So he announced a second tournament where everything would be the same except for one change, the number of rounds per game. See, in the first tournament, each game lasted precisely 200 rounds. And that is important, because if you know when the last round is, then there's no reason to cooperate in that round, so you're better off defecting. Of course, your opponent should reason the same, and so they should also defect in the last round. But if you both anticipate defection in the last round, then there's no reason for you to cooperate in the second to last round, or the round before that, or before that, and so on all the way to the very first round.
And so in Axelrod's tournament, it was a very important thing that the players didn't know exactly how long they were going to be playing. They knew on average it would be 200 rounds, but there was a random number generator that prevented them from knowing with certainty.
Yeah, if you're not sure when it ends, then you have to kind of keep cooperating because it might keep going and you might need them on your side. Yeah. For this second tournament, Axelrod received 62 entries and again added random. The forgiving were winning qualities, so they submitted nice and forgiving strategies. One even submitted tit for two tats. The second camp anticipated that others would be nice and extra forgiving. Therefore, they submitted nasty strategies to try to take advantage of those that were extra forgiving. One such strategy was called Tester. It would defect on the first move to see how its opponent reacted. If it retaliated, Tester would apologize and play tit for tat for the remainder of the game. If it didn't retaliate, Tester would defect every other move after that. But again, being nasty didn't pay.
And once again, tit for tat was the most effective.
Nice strategies again did much better. In the top 15, only one was not nice. Similarly, in the bottom 15, only one was not nasty. After the second tournament, Axelrod identified the other qualities that distinguished the better performing strategies. The third is being retaliatory, which means if your opponent defects, strike back immediately. Don't be a pushover. Always cooperate is a total pushover, and so it's very easy to take advantage of. Tit for tat, on the other hand, is very hard to take advantage of. The last quality that Axelrod identified is being clear.
Programs that were too opaque, that were too similar to a random program, you couldn't figure them out because they were so complicated. It was very hard to establish any pattern of trust with a program like that because you couldn't figure out what it was doing. Not you. I mean, the other programs it was playing couldn't figure them out. And so they would end up more or less defaulting to thinking, every turn is like the last time I'm going to see you, so I might as well defect. What to me is mind-blowing about this is that these four principles, being nice, forgiving, provocable, and clear, is a lot like the morality that has evolved around the world that is often summarized as an eye for an eye. It's not Christianity, by the way. It's not turn the other cheek philosophy. It's some older philosophy.
What's interesting is that while tit for two tats would have won the first tournament, it only came 24th in the second tournament. This highlights an important fact. In the repeated prisoner's dilemma, there is no single best strategy. The strategy that performs best always depends on the other strategies it's interacting with. For example, if you put tit for tat in an environment with only the ultimate bullies of always defect, then tit for tat comes in last.
I wanted to see whether, for example, the tit for tat did well because it did well with really stupid rules that didn't do well at all themselves, that basically took advantage of people.
Of this simulation, because it tests how well a strategy does with other successful strategies. After 1,000 generations, the proportions are mostly stable, and only nice strategies survive. Again, tit for tat comes out on top, representing 14.5% of the total population. Now, this process may sound similar to evolution, but there is a subtle difference, which is that in this case there are no mutations, so it's actually an ecological simulation. But what if the world you started in was different?
Imagine a world that is a really nasty place to live, more or less populated with players that always defect. Except there's a little cluster of tit-for-tat players that live in some kind of nucleus. And they get to play with each other a lot because they're geographically sequestered. They will start building up a lot of points, and also, because that translates into offspring, they'll start to take over the population. So, in fact, Axelrod showed that a little island of cooperation can emerge and spread, and eventually will take over the world, which is fantastic. How can cooperation emerge in a population of players who are self-interested, who are not trying to be good because they're good-hearted. You don't have to be altruistic. You could be looking out for number one, for yourself and your own interests, and yet cooperation can still emerge.
So by now, I'm left almost speechless. I can't help but ponder on the ways that this Keyworks paradigm is played into our very lives. And so many ways that we don't even know being used. And I think it's a key difference to realize that before it was just a regular game and then it's renamed the Prisoner's Dilemma. And if you look it up, under the Prisoner's Dilemma, it's kind of a completely different framework. You got two people who are now prisoners pitted against each other. And so it changes the whole, like, just an earning money to just an even outcast or outsider position. And it's an interesting thing why they do this. But I soon realized there was a mirror here in the scene. And again, things grew more complex, and I can't help but wonder what we're being distracted from. I wanted to find a solution or something, some kind of way to finish this out. So I have a few more videos and decided to just make this video as long as it needs to be, I guess. If you're sticking around, thank you. I don't make this for money. Anyways, to continue, here is somebody...
What if I asked you, hey, how do you feel about the idea of reinstating a kind of rigid Hunger Games-esque societal hierarchy where your opportunities are predetermined based only on your hereditary status? Well, unfortunately, I think the caste system is officially back, codified vis-a-vis a series of carefully crafted pieces of legislation marketed to you, the public, as pro-freedom, pro-choice, pro-opportunity, but are actually designed to do the exact opposite, which is to permanently codify the status of the rich and powerful and make upward or downward mobility challenging or nearly impossible. Let's start with a little bit of context. While the US does not have a formalized caste system like those historically found in other societies such as India, elements of societal hierarchies and structures that mirror certain aspects of caste systems did and some still do exist. The most obvious historical example is, of course, slavery. Slaves were legally considered property from birth, and the legal system restricted their rights, mobility, and opportunities, effectively creating a caste-like division between enslaved individuals and free citizens. Following the abolition of slavery, Jim Crow laws enforced a system of racial apartheid and resulted in separate and unequal treatment of African Americans, limiting their access to things like education, employment, housing, and public facilities. Another often overlooked example that reinforces caste-like dynamics includes simply parental disapproval or even threatening disinheritance when their kids desire to marry someone from a different socioeconomic background, a la the movie The Notebook.
Now, he is a nice boy. He's a nice boy, but he's what? He is what? Trash, not for you.
You see, as a country, America markets to us this idea that no matter your circumstances at birth, everyone is more or less on a level playing field, or at the very least, if you work hard enough, you can achieve anything and everything. But that's just marketing. It's puffery. The reality is much darker and becoming more sinister by the day. Let's examine two pieces of legislation that passed this year in the state of Iowa. The first is HF 68, known as the Students First Act, which approves the use of taxpayer money to fund private schools.
It was a historic night at the State House Monday with both House and Senate lawmakers passing a bill to send taxpayer money to some Iowans to pay for private school tuition. Republicans argued that it is time to use taxpayer money to fund students instead of systems, and that this bill is necessary to make sure that every parent is able to send their kid to the school that best fits their needs.
The second is SF 542, an act relating to youth employment, which allows 14-year-olds to work 6-hour night shifts, allows 15-year-olds to work on assembly lines moving up to 50 pounds, and also allows 16 and 17-year-olds to serve alcohol.
With this bill, we are strengthening and providing protections to our youth. We are not forcing them into slave labor. We are not selling our children. We're not even requiring them to work.
They're fucking with us, right? They have to be, because here's what's actually going down. There is a much bigger plan here. Just think for a second. Whose kids are going to be the ones forced to work these tough jobs? Is it going to be the children of wealthy parents or the children of working class parents? Of course, it's going to be the kids that have to work construction instead of going to school, or work night shifts in a factory, or have to do day labor to provide for their family. They're not the kids working at some local flower shop or interning at a law firm.
It's true that more than a third of teenagers across the U.S. worked summer jobs in 2021, but serving ice cream isn't exactly the same as working in building demolition. So why would lawmakers put kids who are just finishing middle school into such dangerous situations? Here's what Rep. Deo, the House sponsor of the bill, says.
Right now, kids can be out till 10 o'clock if they're out for a sport or a school activity. And so why are they not able to work until, say, for example, 9 o'clock?
Once again, whose kids are playing sports and whose kids are working factory jobs? I will tell you, according to the latest U.S. Census, children in poverty are less likely to participate in sports, gifted programs, and other extracurricular activities. But rolling back child labor is only half of their plan. The other half? Allocating taxpayer money to fund private schools, which the governor of Iowa says will give parents more choice.
Parents have the opportunity to make sure their child is in the best environment that sets them up to be the best that they can be and thrive. And parents are the best ones to make that decision.
That in theory sounds very nice, but let me ask you another question. Whose kids typically go to private school? Is it going to be the children of wealthy parents or the children of working class parents? Many other states already have similar so-called school choice programs, according to Josh Cowan, a professor of education policy at Michigan State University, who has studied school choice for nearly 2 decades. According to his research, the group that benefits the most from such programs are existing private school students. Looking at data from other states that have implemented similar programs, in Arizona, 80% of applications are from children who have never attended a public school. In New Hampshire, 89% have never attended a public school. In Wisconsin, 75% have never attended a public school.
In state after state, doesn't matter the size, the vast majority of these kids were never in public schools to begin with.
Kathy Hoffman, the former Arizona superintendent of public instruction, likened the program to, quote, a taxpayer-funded coupon for the wealthy. In addition, Cowan called into question the rhetoric around opportunities created by school choice or school voucher programs by rightly pointing out that, quote, private schools can decline to admit children for any reason. Students of color, lower income children, and kids struggling academically in the first place.
You know, we know this is not just important for equity, it's important for outcomes too, like intergenerational mobility.
Ding ding ding, that is the plan of the rich and the powerful. Many of them do not want intergenerational mobility, except we are more or less in an era where it's not so acceptable to explicitly prohibit social mobility based on things like class, gender, race, which is why they deliberately frame such laws using words like opportunity or choice. Make no mistake, in today's example, the rolling back of child labor laws, the funding of private schools with public money, they, meaning the rich and the powerful, their plan, which is being implemented across this country one state at a time, is to put your kids to work, take the taxes that they pay and you pay, and use it to fund their own kids' education. It is nothing short of reinstituting a kind of modern-day caste system by tricking you into supporting policies that will, over time, erode your ability to improve your socioeconomic standing in order to control you and deploy you where they see fit. But hey, that's just my analysis. It's what I think. I want to hear your opinion. Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. If you found this video helpful and you want to spread this message or this information to others so we can coalesce against this kind of tyranny, please take a second to like this video, share it, subscribe, and also turn...
So at this point, I wasn't sure how much further to go or just end it soon. But I keep getting dragged back into this while I'm editing it. So I wanted to add this in because a lot of times guys like this get called anti-intellectuals for being radical, for having all these ideas and perspectives on such of these things, or uneducated or illiterate. I've been called many such things even before the stuff I learned to question. I asked just normal questions before. And so I wanted to take a dive into this anti-intellectualism and its role in popular opinion, I guess, and see if we can find some kind of polar configuration to kind of guide us through the archetypes that are going on in here, and try to see if we can figure ourselves out a little bit more.
Everyone watching it is bored by history as well. So I know what people want.
Do you have any personal interest in history yourself?
No, I hate it. Boring. Unless it's something really weird.
The series plays upon the common idea that academics take. Kunk is a textbook anti-intellectual. It's kind of the whole point, or at least the main bit going on here. She represents the ways many of us consume and digest information and art in the modern age. It's gotta be fast, it's gotta be easy, and it doesn't really matter what the source is as long as it appeals to our emotional biases.
The truth.
Many people consider the gap between ignorance and knowledge as so wide to cross that they don't even bother. In my optimism, I like to think they're underestimating themselves, that more people could cross that gap if they tried, or if given the support. But the support and incentives keep dwindling, and with it their will to learn or find an interest in anything mentally demanding. While several aspects from Orwell's 1984 feel all too familiar, things are feeling even more like Huxley's Brave New World, where the masses aren't forced into submission but are pacified with excess pleasure-seeking in the form of mindless entertainment and consumerism. These are our festivals of atonement, the sacred games we've invented to comfort ourselves. In this state, the majority are content not to rise against a harmful and fascistic status quo. Obviously, I'm far from the first person to make this observation, but I see Orwellian tossed around way more than Huxleyan.
You might make quantum bacon.
Would that make it more interesting?
A little bit.
Why would it be more interesting? Because what he's trying
I'm trying to help you out here.
To be fair, this doesn't only happen because people are too stupid or lazy to learn. So many are just trying to survive, or haven't had the opportunity to discover something they actually click with. Like, I find plenty of this stuff compelling, but I'll admit it, and I'm sorry. I look at the Mona Lisa and I think, okay. And yeah, I've read into it, I get it, but the painting just doesn't interest me much. I also hated every moment of my organic chemistry courses in college. And while I read all the Shakespeare required of me, I can't say I enjoyed it. That being said, I never argue that Da Vinci or covalent bonds or Othello aren't worth learning about. Or that scholars in these fields are wasting their time. Which brings me to the external way Kunk represents anti-intellectualism. Her attitude reflects a common contempt for experts and academics. In a Spectator article by Matthew Paris, he suggests this sort of attitude didn't appear from thin air. Quote, "The public distrusts intellect, or at least intellectualism, suspecting, often rightly, that an intellectual will prioritize theory and relegate practice, ignoring evidence and important truths about the way people are as opposed to the way they should be, and preferring ideology." Basically, not only do they feel intellectuals lack a practical view of reality, but people may feel disconnected to or dehumanized by the scholarly world, especially since historically it's mostly associated with the wealthy elite. For many, immediate tangibility is what makes something real and lived through. It's why some climate change deniers might suggest global warming isn't happening because it snowed this morning, or flat earthers might base their claims on the perception of a flat horizon, or creationists doubt evolution because their great-great-grandparents aren't monkeys. I hope I'm exaggerating with that last one, but too many people allow purely anecdotal experience to inform their beliefs, partly because in a weird, self-owned sort of way, they want to believe highly educated people have nothing in common with them. This often leads to them trusting who's relatable rather than reputable.
What makes you think the moon isn't real though, Philomena?
I don't know if you've done your own research, but my mate Paul sent me a video that exposes the whole thing.
Healthy skepticism is necessary, but that's not the same as distrusting or even disliking specialists with real expertise. The latter leaves space for us to believe any random information or give in to conspiracy theory. I think back to the moment Bill Burr mocked Joe Rogan during the pandemic.
I don't want to start this bullshit. I'm not going to sit here with no medical degree, listening to you with no medical degree, with an American flag behind you, smoking a cigar, acting like we know what's up. Better than the CDC. Oh, God.
The internet knows how to manage the worst fire in LA, sitting there in his underwear. You know what? Looking at the footage on the internet, I have determined that this here was mismanaged.
The point is, the internet has only further emboldened randos to spread their often uninformed opinions.
Apparently everyone's caught polarization, which is this sort of brain disease where you're angry all the time. It spreads on the internet and there's no vaccine for it yet. And even if there was, I wouldn't take it because I don't believe in vaccines anymore because of Facebook.
It's like we collectively forgot the saying, you don't know what you don't know. Dunning-Kruger is in full effect. So many people confident in their cluelessness, trying to discredit professionals with decades of study and experience. Grifting pundits and podcasters have become the new preachers, disciples to a cruel, moronic messiah. In an interview with the LA Times, Brooker commented, "People are less shy these days about saying to an expert, 'Yeah, whatever, you may have studied this subject for 25 years, but I just watched a video on YouTube which tells me your life's work is bullshit. I'll tell you why we didn't land on the moon or vaccines don't work.' There's an arrogant swagger to a lot of the alternative truth crowd." I know Brooker said these days, but there's nothing new about this phenomenon. It seems to be a staple of American culture, and it's not much different in the UK, to be clear. I think we've proven time and again that although our circumstances fluctuate, the nature of people hasn't much changed. When anti-intellectualism gets brought up, someone usually mentions this Isaac Asimov quote. There is a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there always has been. The strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. It's from a Newsweek article he wrote in 1980, almost 50 years ago. He continues, "Politicians have routinely striven to speak the language of Shakespeare and Milton as ungrammatically as possible in order to avoid offending their audiences by appearing to have gone to school." He also mourns declining reading scores and that the latest buzzword for highly educated people is now elitist. But again, to call it new was intellectualism in American life, which won the Pulitzer for nonfiction. He broke down this phenomenon into 3 kinds, described concisely by Daniel Rigney in this 1991 article. The first is anti-rationalism, which comes with this idea that emotion is warm and good while reason is cold and bad. Hofstadter mostly associates this notion with a Protestant outlook. As secularism grew, religious leaders felt their ideas of uncompromising faith being challenged, and with it their authority, so they doubled down on defending their beliefs as the universal absolute truth.
They all agree, preach tolerance and forgiveness. A message so important his most ardent followers would eventually start killing anyone who didn't want to hear it.
In a way, Hofstadter agreed with them. Critical thinking is a threat to moral or religious absolutism because, quote, left free, there is nothing it will not reconsider, analyze, throw into question.
Is there a God?
Yes.
Oh, that was quick. Has anyone proved it?
As Rigney wrote, the purpose of rationality is to make critical judgments about the value of competing claims and to give good reasons for preferring one claim over another. The absolutist fear that reason leads to relativism may mask the deeper fear that one's own views will not withstand critical scrutiny. The second form of anti-intellectualism is unreflective instrumentalism, basically only valuing knowledge that provides a practical, usually financial short-term reward. Or the more succinct phrasing, capitalism bad. Now I can tick that word off my video essay checklist. The effect of this view is that we inherently link value with capital or utility. Research and theory is pointless if it's not making somebody somewhere a lot of money.
But with a lot of the 1%ers, it's not their fault they're in the 1%. They were just born there. They've literally done nothing to put themselves in the 1%, so picking on them is literally the same as racism.
The third, and maybe most obvious kind, is anti-elitism. Who do these pretentious nerds think they are? They're up in their ivory towers. They're stuck up, privileged, out of touch. This outlook partly stems from insecurity about one's own knowledge and abilities, but it also has to do with that feeling of dehumanization and disconnection I mentioned earlier. Rigney notes, theory-driven agendas were not readily embraced by those whose educations had been earned, as Eugene Debs put it, in the hard school of human experience. Morgan was actually asked to audition for Philomena with a posh accent, as the program already had a quote-unquote stupid working-class character and they wanted to avoid criticisms of classism. In the end, the only time you can take what she's saying seriously.
Why does humankind feel the need to invent killing machines like this? I know, I just think we're mental. I'm not trying to be controversial, but generally speaking, war does seem a bit of a shame.
The character is even brought to tears when one guest informs her that many countries still stockpile nuclear weapons.
Right, can we talk about something a bit more cheerful?
Anything you like.
Do you like ABBA?
I love ABBA.
In an interview about Kunk on Earth, Brooker was asked if it's harder to make fun of things when the world is getting stupider.
Probably more depressing. Probably more depressing. That's the honest answer, isn't it? It's probably more depressing writing about the state of the world because it's depressing. But I think it's sort of fun doing something like this, which is predominantly stupid rather than it is sort of bewailing the. I'm glad I'm not doing a topical show like a series right at the moment, because I'd probably be crying for 30% of it, which would be...
Because you did with the Trump one, didn't you? You had a bit of a breakdown.
I did have a bit of a breakdown, yeah. On camera, pretty much.
Here they're referring to a segment centered on Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign.
Americans like Trump because he's got loads of money, which is sort of their version of being clever.
In one section, Kunk and Barry Shitpeas detail Trump's instances of being an overall shitty human being.
It's exciting watching footage of his rallies, thinking, oh, this'll be in a documentary in about 20 years' time with ominous music on it. And here's me watching it live.
It also comments on his exacerbation of anti-intellectualism, as he needlessly fearmongers about various groups and casts doubt on experts who actually know what they're talking about.
He says all these things that aren't true, and loads of his followers don't trust the media, so they believe whatever he says. So he can basically create his own mental reality and have thousands of people blindly agree with him. Actually, saying that out loud makes him sound sort of terrifying.
The episode ends with Brooker lamenting the disturbing state of the world, before he scrambles to switch the channel to make himself feel better and laughs maniacally, almost painfully, at an idiotic viral advertisement. It echoes the pleasure-seeking distractions of Brave New World, or quoting Nietzsche on top of Pump Up the Jam's music video, or this meta sketch from Kunk on Life, the latest addition to the Kunkverse.
We're currently seeing maximum growth in a category called Standing on a Ledge Right Now.
This bit references the fictional streaming platform Streamberry, a parody of Netflix. With the rise of AI, many are letting technology do the thinking for them. Why take in the prose and themes of a novel and let it alter your perception? Why learn color theory or technique to create a compelling piece of art? Why do anything that takes mental effort when you can pop a prompt into a computer program and let it do it for you?
I'm supposed to remind you to keep your answer coherent for our fuck-witted viewers.
I wish I could say these silly mockumentaries are purely lighthearted escapism, but Kunk's persona isn't that dissimilar to the reality we live in, where educated and self-educated mean the same thing, where decades of research and peer-reviewed study are the equivalent to a hobbyist interest, a few half-paid attention to TikTok videos, and algorithmically curated echo chambers to validate every opinion. If Brooker's hinting at anything, it's that we're letting ourselves become stupider and more easily exploitable, and it's contributing to a more hopeless world. At the end of the special, Kunk leaves the planet in an alien spaceship. And I guess all I can say is, I wish that were me.
Okay, I was having a little difficulty with my mic, but I'm just going to put some filler audio in here before the rest of the videos.
The perfect man employs his mind as a mirror. It grasps nothing, it refuses nothing, it receives but does not keep. And another poem says of wild geese flying over a lake. The wild geese do not intend to cast their reflection, and the water has no mind to retain their image. But to have no hang-up, that is to say, to be able to drift like a cloud and flow like water, seeing that all life is a magnificent illusion, a playing of energy, and there is absolutely nothing fundamentally to be afraid of.
Because you see, we grow out of this world in exactly the same way that the apples grow on the apple tree. If evolution means anything, it means that. But you see, we curiously twist it. We say, well, first of all, in the beginning, there was nothing but gas and rock. And then intelligence happened to arise in it, you know, like a sort of fungus or slime on the top of the whole thing. But we're thinking in a way, you see, that disconnects the intelligence from the rocks. Where there are rocks, watch out. Watch out, because the rocks are going eventually to come alive.
To understand Klaus Schwab and the eventual World Economic Forum, it all stems from the core ideas of Henry Kissinger. During his time as a professor at Harvard, Henry Kissinger's main ideas revolve around realpolitik, a practical and strategic approach to international relations that emphasizes power dynamics over ideology or moral considerations. He believes that global stability can only be achieved through a balance of power among nations, not by pursuing idealistic or moral goals.
Kissinger focused on the need for leaders to understand the motives, intentions, and potential moves of other states operating in a world where each nation acts to maximize its power and security.
His approach reflects the basics of game theory, understanding what others might do, adjusting strategies when situation changes, and seeking equilibrium where stability can be maintained. With his prestigious educational background, Klaus Schwab lands a lucrative career as the director of Sulzer Escher Weiss AG in Zurich, serving on the managing board. It is a Swiss engineering firm where his father was a senior member. His role is pivotal and challenging, as he is tasked with restructuring the company during a critical period in the late 1960s.
So where do we go from here? Well, I guess we have to increase our awareness, which is the only true scale of intelligence here. It's how aware of your effects on others and the world around you, on you, and how you can zen through it. So I guess I just have a few more videos and clips to go through, because I don't have much more to say. At least as far as this trail leads. We'll go through other keystones in depth in separate, hopefully shorter videos, but thank you for your time.
I spent 20 years in the U.S. military. I'm a behavior expert. I've trained PSYOPs. I'm the best-selling author in behavioral psychology. I want to show you exactly how to identify what we call engineered reality, or what some people call PSYOPs. At the end of this, I'm going to give you a tool that's literally going to give you a score out of 100 that shows you how likely something is to be a PSYOP. Let's do this. So the first thing you need to know is following the FATE model: focus, authority, tribe, and emotion. This is what triggers the mammalian part of our brain that makes all of our real decisions. The first part is focus. PSYOPs always aim to hijack your attention with repetition, shocking visuals of fear-inducing scenarios. Some examples are like 24/7 media coverage of a crisis, or constant repetition of terms like unprecedented. So with this, pause and ask, why is this message being pushed so aggressively? So compare how much airtime different stories are receiving and note any disproportionate focus. The second part here is authority. Trusted figures might shift their tone or positions unnaturally to support the narrative. So watch very closely for expert panelists or endorsements where authority figures might speak outside of their expertise. Pay close attention to that one. Then we have tribe. So messages that polarize opinions or create stark in-groups versus out-groups, or exploit our tribal instincts. For example, labeling groups as patriots versus traitors, or scientific versus deniers. Be very careful when you hear that language. Finally, we have emotion. So be wary of any communication that triggers strong emotions like fear, hope, or outrage without any clear, verifiable evidence. So emotional responses suppress critical thinking. Emotional responses suppress critical thinking. So as a tip here, analyze the evidence that's presented to you. If facts are replaced by appeals to emotion, you need to be very, very cautious. As an example of this, think about like a news channel repeatedly showing images of empty grocery shelves and panicked shoppers during a food supply scare. It dominates every broadcast and it pushes people into fear-driven behavior. Next, question novelty. Our brains are wired to focus on sudden or unusual changes because they signal potential threats or opportunities. And this is an evolutionary survival mechanism. PsyOps exploit this by creating events that break normal expectations, like unexpected crises or dramatic revelations. So ask yourself, why is this new? So consider if the event or somebody's message has been artificially manufactured or timed. Look for patterns like sudden shifts in public opinion, trending hashtags that are unusual, or viral videos that seem very coincidental. So for this one, just picture a new viral video just claims to expose a government cover-up, but it conveniently comes out the exact same day that there's some damaging evidence against some high-ranking official. The timing shifts public focus. All of this is part of the NCI system I developed for teaching tradecraft and extreme psychological operations. And there's even a gigantic textbook for all of this stuff in the description. Definitely not for everybody, but it's definitely the most comprehensive guide in the world on this stuff. So next item, look for multiple sources. Centralized narratives create an echo chamber, and they silence dissent and they narrow perspectives. For example, if all media outlets present identical talking points, it is a humongous red flag. So actively seek out contrarian or independent voices, even if they challenge something that's already in your head. So in reality, an example, during a maybe breaking health crisis, all the major news outlets report on the exact same study, but independent researchers revealed the study was funded by a company selling the solution. So watch for that group speak. Next is identify cognitive dissonance weapons. Let's talk about how this works. So cognitive dissonance comes up when new information clashes with our identity or our beliefs. So PsyOps exploit the hell out of this by including micro-agreements. Micro-agreements are little small, seemingly harmless concessions to shape your identity. And over time, you're going to unconsciously align your behavior to reduce that internal conflict. And as a weaponization example of this, a PsyOp might present you as a part of moral or intelligent enlightenment, like only good citizens do XYZ. If you disagree with that, you risk some identity conflict there. So reflect on your identity and ask, am I being nudged to identify with some other group? So be very careful of any campaigns that are asking for seemingly minor commitments there, like signing petitions, changing your profile picture that evolves into some bigger compliance or demand later. As an example of this, let's say a company launches an ad campaign and they claim real patriots buy local. If you disagree with their product, it feels like rejecting your identity as a patriot. So this pushes you to conform. Be very, very skeptical about those identity statements. Next is looking for those emotional scripts. And what I mean by this is the scripts that were written in our brains by our ancestors. So manipulated narratives trigger instincts like the fear of loss or scarcity, social rejection, or danger. For example, a media story about food shortages might activate survival scripts that cause panic buying and stuff like that. And we have scarcity fear. This is sudden warnings about limited resources like water or medicine. Also sparks that kind of behavior. And then we have tribal rejection. These are threats of being socially outcast, like you're selfish if you don't comply. And those things override logic every time. And as a tip for this, break the script by focusing on the facts. Like, what's the likelihood of this scenario? So compare the claims with other sources. For this, just picture where a politician says something like, if we don't act now, our children will not have a future. This taps into survival instincts, those ancestor scripts in our head, and it's tied to protecting offspring. It creates urgency without any facts. Next is follow the money. So there's a trail of beneficiaries here. So identifying who benefits always is going to reveal the motive. So look for funding sources like sponsorships or political connections that are tied to the narrative. So use tools like opensecrets.org or public financial records to see who profits from this. So for policies or campaigns, identify the industries like pharmaceuticals, tech companies, etc., that stand to gain the most. So to illustrate this in your mind right now, picture a charity that's promoting clean energy awareness, and they seem noble until an investigations are showing that it's funded by a solar panel corporation that's lobbying for subsidies or something like that. Next, and this one is very important, is analyze the context boundary. The mechanism here is context, and context defines what is permissible. So manipulative people shift contexts to normalize extreme behavior. As an example of this, in emergencies, people accept surveillance or martial law that they normally would completely resist. So ask, what is the context? Compare some similar events in different settings to see if the rules or responses seem disproportionate. Look for contradictions. So for lots of the students who are brand new to NCI University, this right here is the most massive realization when they realize that the ability to weaponize cognitive dissonance and then shift the context can get anyone to do almost anything. As a hypothetical example of this, let's say there's a major cyber attack. The governments are now justifying some sweeping surveillance laws to protect the citizens. This changes the context to make previously unacceptable actions seem absolutely necessary. Next, spot the use of archetypes because they're woven into our brains. PsyOps simplify narratives by using archetypes like heroes and villains and saviors. Some examples are like portraying one leader as the sole solution or demonizing dissenters as the enemy. Deconstruct the story. Ask, who are the characters and what roles are they playing? Simplistic, like good versus evil stories usually signal manipulation just about every time. So always seek nuance there. In the real world, you're going to see something like maybe a leader is repeatedly portrayed as a savior fighting something that's pure evil, and the narrative ignores their mistakes and oversimplifies the conflict to prevent a lot of scrutiny. Next, evaluate the frame. So let's do a step-by-step evaluation here. First one is expectation. What are you expected to believe or do based on this thing that you're exposed to in the media? Next is belief. What assumptions are being made about you, like your values or your fears? Then we have perception. So how is reality being shaped, like selective facts or missing contexts? And definition is the final step here when it comes to a frame. What truth is being asserted as something that's completely unchallengeable? This comes up with information suppression. So really look for topics that are being avoided, critics that are being silenced. If somebody needs to be silenced in order for an idea to make it, then the idea is not good. So alternative viewpoints being discredited, that's a big one to look out for. So cross-check timelines of events and notice if critics are labeled conspiracists or if algorithms are suppressing some kind of specific search. And this is a big one, especially in today's time. So to get a good example of this, during maybe a corporate scandal, the company's PR team frames these critics as disgruntled employees with a grudge. So this shifts the focus away from the legitimate concerns to the motives of the critics. And it does it almost without us realizing that that's happening in our brain. So next, be alert to rapid compliance shifts. This one is scary and it's happening every day. PsyOps create urgency to drive rapid compliance. And these tactics are stuff like emotional appeals, staged group behaviors, or false consensus. For this, it's really important to slow down and resist the pressure to act, to question the conformity as much as possible, and test the message, engaging the skeptics there. So in the real world, this might look like maybe a viral social media challenge urges all these users to adopt this brand new symbol or profile picture or hashtag kind of overnight. and it creates a wave of compliance. So later, this is kind of like a foot in the door technique. It's tied to some divisive political agenda. Next, study the timing of the events. This one's huge, especially right now. Timing is everything. Ask yourself, why is this happening now? So what other events or scandals might this thing be distracting everybody from? So look for very coincidental timing with unrelated major news stories or political movements. PSYOPs can very often be smoke screens. And in real life, you might see stuff like a huge celebrity breakup floods all of the headlines exactly as some major investigative report about government corruption is about to be released. Coincidence? Probably not. The next thing I want you to do is to sharpen your brain to start hearing and understanding these manipulation tactics. And one of the biggest things that you can do, the most effective way that I could train you right now, just you and me, is to teach your brain to recognize logical fallacies. So let's go through these, because PSYOPs very often use these flawed arguments to convince people. And if you know how to spot them, it makes you a lot harder to manipulate. Let me give you 10 of these so that your brain gets hardwired to start seeing everything a whole lot differently. So the first one that you're going to see all the time, appeal to emotion. So this uses fear and anger and hope to bypass logic. So like, if you don't support this, children are going to suffer. Next is the straw man argument. This misrepresents somebody's argument so they can attack it better. So somebody might say they oppose the lockdowns because they don't care about lives. Think about that. Number 3 is the bandwagon fallacy. So this claims that something is true because everyone supports it. And this is, you hear this all the time. Millions of people agree with X, Y, and Z. You should agree with it too. Number 4 is the false dilemma. This presents only 2 extreme options and it ignores alternatives. So it's the either you're with us or you're against us fallacy there. Number 5 is the ad hominem attacks. This is the attack of the person and not the argument. Be very observant for this. So this is when you hear you can't trust her. She's not a scientist. You can't do X because they're not qualified based on X. Ad hominem is very common, and I want your brain to be able to spot it. Number 6 is appeal to authority. And this is a claim that something is true because an authority figure said so. So like Dr. X supports it, so it's absolutely right. You have to trust the science. Number 7 is the slippery slope. These are claims that one action is going to lead to some extreme negative outcome. So you've heard this before. Somebody says something like, if we allow this, we're going to lose all of our freedoms. All of our freedoms are gone. The country is gone. All of that kind of talk like that. Be very attuned to when you hear that and very cautious when you hear that. Number 8, hasty generalizations. And these are broad claims that are made with very little evidence. So the example is 2 politicians lied, so all of them must be corrupt. So giant claim, tiny bit of evidence. 2 politicians might have lied, so they're all corrupt. Number 9 is huge. It's the red herring. So this distracts people with irrelevant information. You've heard this maybe as an example when somebody says, why are we worrying about climate change when we have so much crime going on right now? It's an argument of distraction. Number 10 is false equivalence. This compares 2 things as equals when they're absolutely not equal. So you'll hear somebody say something in the news that's both sides have extremists, so they're exactly the same. That's a very damaging one. I know there's a lot of information here, so I want to give you access to the actual tool that we use to identify PSYOPs that even rates the likelihood on a 1 to 100 scale. I'm going to add that into the description right.
So that, on the other hand, was very insightful. I think I've learned a few things, and of course it was another test and 4 key concepts and whatnot, but let me know what you think. Let me know how you guys would overlay this. I hope this video has brought some value to you in your life, or your alternative research, and your alternative theories. And I hope you all stay safe out there. And I've just got to show you, or let you hear the song that was inspired by the code test, and then leave you with some words for Alan.
today, I can't delay. They say my future's on display. Got my number 2 pencil, nerves of steel. Here's the deal, take the G-O-A-T, don't hesitate. Will I be a hero or push paper all day? Doctor, mechanic, or just sweep the halls. The overseer's watching, so I better not stall. Question 1, there's a radroach near. Do you squash it quick or run in fear? ABC, who knew a test could decide for me? Take G-O-A-T, don't hesitate. Am I vault security or cleaning the graves? Maybe a farmer or fixing the lights. Either way, guess I'm stuck here for life. Moira says I'd make a fine repair guy, but I'm dreaming about the stars in the open sky. No test can tell me who I am inside. Gotta take my chance, gotta take that ride. The teacher grins, he's seen it all. Good news, kid, you won't clean stalls. I got my robot deep inside. I know there's a world where my dreams collide. Take the G-O-A-T, don't hesitate. Might be a scientist, but I'm planning my escape. Behind these walls, my heart won't stay. Gotta see what's beyond common. So I'll take my Pip-Boy, grab my pack, because the future ain't written on some paper stack. One way or another, I'll break free. Ain't no test gonna define me.
Stop right there, criminal scum!
Alrighty, so that just about wraps it all up. Stay warm, stay safe, and stay gold out there, everybody.
This whole sense of estrangement, foreignness to the world is overcome in Zen. The Zen people, as you meet them and as you get to know their style of personality, are at ease in a culture that is not at ease. In a culture that is chronically concerned with protocol. And is it just right? That is indeed a terribly self-conscious culture, where everybody is always watching themselves and having therefore second thoughts about everything. And so the discipline of Zen is to enable you to act without watching yourself. We would say unself-conscious. But Japanese are as terrified of this as we are. They think, and we think, if I don't watch myself, I'll make a mistake. If I don't hold a club over myself, I'll cease to be civilized and become a barbarian. If I don't discipline myself with all sorts of down on those passions of yours, you will become like the monk of Siberia who burst from his cell and devoured the Father Superior. So this basic mistrust and so on in one's own spontaneity makes us wonder that if the Zen people are really spontaneous and they don't plan and premeditate and hold clubs over themselves, won't they become very, very dangerous people socially? Won't they go out and their mothers and daughters and murder their grandmothers to inherit their fortunes and so on and so forth? And Zen people just don't do that. And yet they are perfectly spontaneous.
So I also really liked the goat song, and I thought that video was funny. So I'm gonna make it play one more time and finish out.
The leak's underwater. Think you could fix them?
Well, today's a day, I can't delay. They say my future's on display. Got my number 2 pencil, nerves of steel. What's my fate? Well, here's the deal. Take the G-O-A-T, don't hesitate. Will I be a hero or push paper all day? Doctor, mechanic, or just sweep the halls? The overseer's watching, so I better not stall. Question 1, there's a rad roach near. Do you squash it quick or run in fear? Simple A, B, C, or D. Who knew a test could decide for me? Take the G-O-A-T, don't hesitate.
Are you human? That's just what a synth would do.
Maybe a father or vixen. What? Either way, guess I'm stuck here for life. Lord says I'd make a fine repair guy, but I'm dreaming about the stars in the open sky. No test can tell me who I am inside. Gotta take my chance, gotta take that ride. The teacher grins, he's seen it all. Good news kid who won't clean stalls. I got my role, but deep inside I know there's a world where my dreams collide. Take the G-O-A-T, don't hesitate. Might be a scientist, but I'm planning my escape. Behind these walls, my heart won't stay. Gotta see what's beyond, come what may. So I'll take my Pip-Boy, grab my pack, cause the future ain't written on some paper stack. One way or another, I'll break free. Ain't no test gonna define me.